Well, good afternoon, everyone. Um, it's a real honor to be hosting this event and speaking to my friend and fellow author and fellow laureate, Norma Dunning. So, Norma is an Inuk writer, professor, and grandmother. I don't know which order you prefer those be listed in, Norma, but and Norma recently won the 2021 Governor General's Literary Award for English Language Fiction for her book Tainna. Her first collection of short stories, Annie Mukluk and other stories, is it Muktuk? And other stories received the Danuta Gleed Literary Award. Norma's collection of poetry, Eskimo Pie, A Poetics of Inuit Identity, was released in 2020. Norma lives in Edmonton. And just a quick word about the Writers' Trust Amplified Voices. It's a collective campaign to promote books published during the COVID-19 pandemic by Canadian authors who identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. The goal is to give those authors who missed out on an in-person book launch type of event, or the festival circuit, or bookstore foot traffic, another opportunity to be discovered by readers. And let me tell you, if you haven't read anything by Norma yet, you're missing out. So you should definitely get um, one of her books, and I highly recommend the one we're going to be talking about today. So 25 authors, 24 in addition to Norma, were selected by an independent 5-person committee representing the literary community from coast to coast. And you can find more information about this initiative on the Writers Trust website. So as for myself, I'm just going to do a quick intro in Cree. Darrel J. So So I just said I'm Darrel, and I'm from the area, originally from the area where Norma lives now, near Edmonton, Alberta. Edmonton is a Miskwachi Waskahigan in Nehiao, or my language. So Norma, welcome. It's so wonderful to see you, and wonderful to be speaking with you again, to be visiting like this.
Thank you, and thank you to the Writers Trust for especially thinking about all of us who were going through the pandemic. And it really is because I launched 2 books through the pandemic, and it really is difficult and I missed having a live audience. And in November, third week of November, I was invited to the Vancouver's International Writers Festival, and it was the first time I got to read to an audience in a couple of years, and I was just amazed with how good it felt to be able to be able just to read your work in front of people. And I had really very much missed the audience overall. I really truly did.
I can't imagine that feeling of that new contact, because I had the same thing, the renewed contact with in public events, at readings like that. It was just great. So Norma, shall we start? Speaking of readings, shall we start with the reading? Would you like to do that?
Sure. Um, like I can read more than once too, Darrel.
Sure, absolutely.
But I'll just read the opening of the cover story. So it's the last story in the collection, and it is it's a story that stayed with me. Well, all the stories stayed with me for quite a long time before I ever write about them. But this story
Hmm.
probably started with me in around, oh gosh, probably like in around 2011 that this story started to sit inside of me before I ever put it onto the page. So it is Tainna, the Unseen Ones. Billy Townsend slid his skiddy ass onto the John Deere lawnmower. It was still a bit dark out, leaving the early spring morning air heavily scented with dew. He loved that smell. One of the best things about his job was being able to head out onto the golf course and drive the mower in the early morning. After 3 decades of military assignments that scattered his life with time zones, This early morning duty was his simplest. He had finally reached that point in his life where he could relax at work, something he had never been able to do when serving his country. Today was the first mowing of the greens for the season, one of his favorite days. He knew it would be a long day, but the first mow was always the best mow. He had seen it all during his years of service. So many cold nights during desert storms, so many hot, sweltering days when you begged God for a breeze, and when it came, it was loaded with sand that would seep its way into every crack of your body, every line on his face. He put in those final years and got the hell out onto Civvy Street, where his biggest concern was getting through the Tim Hortons drive-through on his way to work. It was a simple life now. He liked the routine of his days, the hum and flow of life without others to answer to. Each spring, summer, and early fall, all he had to do was mow the lawn. He smiled at the thought of his French military buddies making fun of him and calling him Billy Modelon. He hummed in time with his mower motor as he headed off toward the first green. Cresting the small hill, he looked down upon a flock of Canada geese sitting in a circle, with their necks pointing outwards, sitting like bison do when protecting their young against aggressors. Billy couldn't believe his eyes. He put his mower into stealth mode and moved silently towards the geese. There must be 60 of them, he thought. He had never seen this formation. He had never seen geese behave like this. Not that he was a hunter, not that he really understood nature, but he knew a bit of this and that. And of this, he was certain. Geese did not sit in bison circles. He eased his mower toward the circle. Not one of the geese moved. Not one goose let loose a honk. Not one of them lifted its head from under its wing. Billy didn't understand it. He was confused. He felt like he was in a bad dream where everything falls into slow motion. He touched his left pocket to make sure that he had his cell phone. How was he going to explain what he had seen when he talked to his wife? Here he was, a decorated soldier, a man who had served his country, who had sat through raids and had Spitfire artillery splashing all around him. And now, here he sat frozen, a couple of yards away from a flock of geese sitting in a circle and acting as passive as Gandhi. He didn't know what to do. Play duck, duck, goose? He started to whistle London Bridge is falling down. Not one goose lifted its head. He started to sing a When the Saints Come Marching In. Not one goose lifted its head. Billy decided to stand on his machine and flap his arms, calling out to them in a language that he was sure they understood. Honk, honk. Not one goose lifted its head. Finally, he jumped off his machine and decided to take a run at them. He put his head down and dug his right foot into the thick Kentucky bluegrass and pushed his body forward with his head wrapped inside his tattooed forearms. "Arr!" he growled. And when he up, he saw the geese taking a few steps. They were cluttering his daybreak. He stood in awe as all 60 of them swelled into the beautiful first light canvas of red and soft blue. He felt a tear slip from one eye and sighed. What a beautiful sight. What a gorgeous start to his day. If he was a religious man, he would have called it a blessing. He turned his body turned in a slow semicircle, following the pattern of the wings taking flight. All he could think to do was to applaud the symphony of geese that filled the sunrise. His hands pounded against one another and reached high over his head, a singular standing O. He was in a state of amazed at the beauty of life, amazed at nature, and amazed and grateful for being alive. He shook his head and uttered a quiet thank you to the sky, smacked his wide palm against his lips, and blew a kiss heavenward. He turned back towards his machine, and that was when he saw it, a lump. A lump curled up in the fetal position. He walked towards the lump and turned on the flashlight app of his phone. A body, not a lump, a frozen body. It had clearly been lying on the fairway through winter. He stepped carefully toward it. It wasn't moving. There was no breath rising from the shoulders. There was nothing. He shouted, "Hello?" even though he knew there was no point, no movement. He knew he shouldn't touch it, but he couldn't help himself. He put the toe of his running shoe against the right shoulder of the body and gave it a gentle tap. No movement. Rigor mortis had turned this body into a solid heap of solid decay. He told himself just one more try before he dialed out. Billy shoved the shoulder hard enough to see that it was a woman's inside of a black hoodie. He made the call that no one ever wants to make. He dialed 911. "My name is Major General Billy Townsend. I just found a dead Indigenous woman on the golf course that I work at." And that's the opening.
Wow, that was powerful. I love your reading voice. Like, I could listen to you for a long, long time. I'm wondering, is there a plan to do an audio version of your book? And if so, are you considering reading it?
For funding to turn Annie into an audiobook. And there are these kind of ridiculous rules where they don't want the author to do the reading. And so if you're an Indigenous author, they want to find an Indigenous person to read your book. So there's those kind of silly rules. And so then I looked into having a private studio record my book. But I mean, that all, and then the pandemic came. So that was the end of that idea. But I like reading, and I like reading my own work, and I think that an audience deserves to hear the author's voice and to hear it the way they hear it. And because when we're writing, Darrel, it's in our heads. We know how it sounds. But how do we put that onto a page, and how do we get it to where other people can hear it the way we hear it?
Right. Well, that is a good segue into one of the questions that I had planned to ask you, and it's about the sound, the rhythm of your work. Your just reading your book, the first couple of paragraphs, I was drawn in immediately, and I was trying to figure out, like, I read a lot, and when I come across an author I really connect with, like you and your work, I'm always looking to see what there is. So, what is it about the work that draws me in so richly? And your characters come alive instantly, the first time they're mentioned. And then the dynamic between your characters is so vivid, and you accomplish that very quickly too. So I'm just curious about your process. Do you say your stories are with you a long time before you write them? And I'm just curious about how you do that transition from the mind and heart to the page.
It's I don't know how to really explain it very, very well, but I think one of the I did this writing workshop, and I don't get a lot of work that way, but I did a writing workshop, and I called it "What's Your Beat?" And so I was presenting the shop to 5 different groups of high school students. And when they would come into my room, they'd look around and say, "Where's the drums?" And I would say, "There aren't any." And so, what I wanted them and what they had to figure out is I said to them, when we live through our day, we're living in a rhythm and in a beat as our day goes along. And so, but we're unaware of it. We should be, but we're not. And so then they each had to write some poetry. And as they were saying, reading out their poetry, we snapped our fingers to the meter, so it becomes obvious. So to me, that's our whole lives are like a song. And every day we're singing in a different kind of rhythm as the day progresses. And so I think that kind of rhythm just appears in my work. It's not something that I really sit down and think a lot about. But I do think a lot about how every word has to stand, every sentence has to be perfect. And so for me, in reality, Darrel, my writing process is just a lot of rewriting. That's all it really is. And I've had people who, and I know writers who actually have the time and the luxury, to me it's luxury, of getting up in the morning and being able to write for like 2 3 hours and then go off and do something else and come back and return to their work. And some of them will have 2 or 3 storyboards going. Like, I've never had that life. My life is, the semester's over, now I'm going to write. Like, that's how it has always worked out for me. And I always end up doing more than one job. It's not like I only teach for the University of Alberta. I do teach there, but I always end up having all these other kind of like side gigs going on. And so time is very, very limited, and I write when I can. Like, that's all there is to it. Like, I wish I had a magic story or a recipe for writing. I don't. I
Well,
really
I
don't.
realized during my while I was writing my first memoir, Mamaskatch. It's a series of connected short stories, and I realized during that process that the cultural way of thinking that my parents and grandparents and great grandparents had has been passed on to me. And I didn't know that because I went through kindergarten to grade 12. Well, there wasn't kindergarten in those days. I went through 12 years of school and then university in the Western society. And it didn't occur to me that the innate Cree way of thinking, I say in my book, my mom's brain was hardwired for Cree.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering how much of what's happening with you is a cultural continuity or a cultural an effect of your cultural background, your genetic composition too, in fact.
Well, I believe in that a great deal. And take some time, Daryl, and read about blood memory and how does blood memory work, and how I explored it a little bit in my PhD thesis. But I was reading from different medical doctors and people who work in the areas of psychology. And this one doctor, he talked about how uh, our brain, when we arrive, our brain is not just this empty sponge. Instead, we arrive with all this memory that has been passed down to us. And then it's up to us to go find it and ignite it. And so it becomes, so for me, it wasn't until it's similar to you. You go to K to 12. My dad was in the military. We did move every 2 years, and you kind of get used to this sort of nomadic existence, existence where you don't really make friends, because like friends are the people you leave behind, and so you don't really go and make friends, and so you're living this kind of life. And we would move to another community, and the first thing my parents would do, like, they drive around, figure out where all the berries were growing. And my dad hunted, thank goodness. And um and my mom loved fish, and like, God, I hate that. And she was like, it's 4 in the morning, and she'd be like, time to get up, the moon. I looked at the moon. It's a good fish moon. Let's go. And I would be like, I hate this. I absolutely hate it. But I had no choice. I had to go. So I think what we have to spend time with, because we grow up in a society that tells us over and over and over again that we are living like from a point of loss. You don't have your language. Your skin isn't dark enough. You're not living where you're supposed to be living. All these kind of things are happening to Indigenous youth as they're coming up. But what I tell my students, because I will always have a few Indigenous students in my room, what I say to them is, when people start to ask you those kind of, or put that kind of information into your face about how your skin isn't the right color, and you don't speak what should have been your mother tongue, just ask them, why do you think like that? And ask it quietly. Like, don't start a big fight. Don't be like that. But to ask it quietly, because what that does is that makes that it actually shifts power in a conversation. But it also makes that person have to really think about, why are they thinking the way they do? What are their perceptions of Indigenous people? And I think, especially for Inuit, it's like, we can never be modern day people. We can never be, just a regular person who gets up and goes to work and gets a coffee on your way to work. And, like, we're all supposed to be up north, and that's all there is to it. So a lot of my work looks at Inuit who live in the South, because about a third of our Canadian population is living in the South. And that number will just continue to grow and grow and grow. And and I think mainstream has to trouble it. So when I put together my work, it's more about trying to make people reconfigure their thinking of what Inuit people are, and to recognize that, what, like, I get up in the morning and I go to work. Like, that's what I do. I'm not sitting here, I don't, like, I'm not chewing on caribou hide. And but it's these perceptions. And I attribute a lot of that thinking back to curriculum, and how people are taught coming through K to 12, and how absent Inuit are, absolutely absent. Then you get into post secondary, and again, another big absence within the curriculums that sit in post secondary. So to me, it's important. It's important work, and and I think it does make a difference. And what I hope is that that I'm just breaking ground for the next group of Inuit writers who come along behind me, and just really get going and get writing. And I think that's so important. It's just so important, Darrel. So
I
thanks.
agree, it is, and I guarantee you, you're knocking down doors and breaking glass ceilings and all that good stuff. So congratulations on that. I'm intrigued by the title of your book, Norma, Tainna, the Unseen Ones. Could you just talk a little bit about that, how you got to that title and why you chose it as the title of your book?
Well, the people, my characters are I think often the people we don't want to deal with, the people we don't want to have to look at, and the spirit world is involved in this book, but also I talk about like the everyday people, the girl at McDonald's, the person who gives you like all these people that we don't pay attention to. And so to me, they become like unseen people. And I talk about how with the story Kunak, that that story came about sitting on a Edmonton bus. I mean, it had to be minus a million outside that day. It was very, very cold. And it was dark, of course. And it's like 3 in the afternoon and it's pitch black. And so I've been waiting for this bus for a little, like probably 40 minutes. And finally, the bus arrives. And of course, it is packed. But there is this one gentleman with the seat next to him is empty. So I sit down beside him. And as soon as I sat down, I thought, ugh, now I know why this seat is empty. Like this guy stinks. And but what was weird is that we both turn and we look at each other at the same time. Like we both turn and look at each, and that's when I realized this guy is Inuit. This guy is Inuit. And I say to him, "How are you?" And he looks at me and he says, "I don't know." And I said, "Hey, come on, how are you?" And he said, "I don't know. Nobody ever asks." And it was just like this sadness. I just felt this sadness. And so he was getting off at the next stop, and so I move, and then he gets out into the aisleway, and before he leaves, he turns back, and he looks at me and he says, thank you," and that was it. That was our whole conversation. And but I will say I spent the next 2 years on White Avenue trying to find that guy, and I kept thinking, I'm going to find him. I'm going to find him. I don't know what I'm going to do when I find him, but I'm going to find him. And I never did. I never did. So when I think about, and I've taught creative writing to homeless people at Boyle Street and homeless youth through iHuman, and long contracts like a full year kind of contracts with these, and going into spaces that I think nobody else wants to go into. Like nobody wants that gig. But holy, that's some of the best writing. That's some of the best that I've ever had the privilege to be a part of. But so we have these people like homeless people, and I think about senior citizens, like all these people that we don't pay attention to. And to me, they're like the unseen ones. They're the unseen ones. And so when this book was coming together, um, it just made sense to me to use Tainna as the title because it means the unseen ones. I will say this, I am Padlai Inuit. So we, Padlai Inuit originated just above the tree line of northern Manitoba in the Keewatin district in that area. And one of the things that other Inuit, when they would talk about my Inuit, they would call them the unseen ones. And so to me, there's that little bit of connection into the title as well. Thanks, Darrel.
Well, that's another good segue. I love the flow our conversation is taking. In my first memoir, one chapter is written from my mother's perspective when she was on a street person, a homeless person on the same streets of Edmonton that two of your characters and even spirit characters inhabit for a while. And so that was another big hook for me for your book. It just drew me right in there. What was it like for you to write these sections of the book and writing from that point of view?
Do you mean like writing about Edmonton? um, when
the
I
point of view of a down and out person, a street person.
well, I think it's something people have to spend time with, and it's really interesting. I had one of the writing profs at the U of A who I was never in his class. He sent me an email and he said, Norma, thank you for writing this book. I will never think of the death of a street person in the same way again. And so to me, that's one person who changed his thinking. And then I thought, well, it was worth it. It was worth it to write the book. But what do we do? We're in this Yuletide time, and so there will be a lot of focus on homeless people and making sure that there's many different dinners and charitable kind of events happening. But those things should happen every day. Like, why are we only saving it up for Christmas? And I think we have to think about homeless people and and not so much try to pull them off the street, but to help them make the choice to come in. And when I worked at Boyle Street, I worked with this one young guy. He one of the best writers. If I could find that guy, like, amazing. And he had made the choice to come in, but now he's put into a work program, and he has all these kind of rules, that he has to adhere to. But I think we have to, and it's not about catering to homeless people. It's about taking the time to recognize them and to say hello on a bus. And here on a bus sits a PhD Inuit woman and a homeless Inuit man. And we're driving along through the streets of Edmonton on a city bus. And so I think we have to give time, we have to give thought to it. And so I think often I write about stuff that makes people uncomfortable. And, if it's not uncomfortable, then don't write it. Like, don't write it. If it's something, like, I'll never write about butterflies and bumblebees. That'll never happen. And I know it won't. That's not going to happen. I'm not writing that stuff. But it's I think we have to draw attention, and especially if we each carry a gift, each of us. We've each been gifted in some way. And so use that gift to give back in some way to your own. And this book, if it raises the visibility of Inuit people here on the streets in Edmonton, good, good. It did something.
Absolutely. Well, working in the Boyle Street program, you probably worked with some of my cousins, so there's a very good
Probably.
chance. So thank you for your good work there with them, and I'm sure they appreciated your efforts and probably found it a rich experience. I touched on this a little bit in an earlier question about how you captivated me, and I'm sure all readers, with your lyrical voice, what I describe as a lyrical voice right from the get-go. And it'll take me a while to try and understand how you did that. But as you probably know, from writing courses, I don't know if this is your philosophy, but many writing instructors talk about maximizing the use of the five senses. You know, smell, sound, sight, touch, that sort of thing. But in the first couple of chapters of your book, I thought you were really minimalist with that. And then when you do a description, it's just like explosive. And I'm thinking in particular of the trip to Banff, and so I thought there was going to be, description of waterfalls and cascades and, emerald forest creeping up the mountain and the smoky gray mountaintops, but there was none of that. But then you come up with where the protagonist is sitting, in a campground outside of her sister's trailer and says something like, I felt like we'd been photoshopped onto a postcard. And it's just like, boom. That was so incredibly brilliant because, I mean, who hasn't seen one of those picturesque postcards of mountains, right? So I'm just amazed at how you did that. I'm again going to sort of probe a little bit of how deliberate that was. Did you kind of suppress the five senses for the first couple of chapters, or what was your process there?
I can't, I have no process. And
Okay,
really
good.
don't.
That's
I'm
comforting to me.
disappointment. I'm such a disappointment. I don't follow any of the rules. And, I've recently, I just finished up an Indigenous Writers Circle with Audible Yulu. We actually finished up yesterday, and it was like a 6 month commitment with them. And one of my students had studied at UBC and was in their MFA program. And so she's having this really hard time trying to put together what is a brilliant idea, a really brilliant idea. And I said to her, why don't you take all your notes from your writing classes at UBC and put them in a box and stick them in the basement and never refer to them again? And so for me, when I was in creative writing classes, what it did for me, first of all, it forces you to write. And are you writing your best? No, you're not, because you're writing within a 4 or 5 day time frame and having to churn out these stories in a very limited amount of time. And you're also writing for a grade. So it's not like you're really writing for whatever is happening inside of your own head. So, but what I think it did, I think it exposed me to literature that I would not have normally read, and that's and for me, I was grateful for that to read people that I would normally never even think of reading, and to me, that's what creative writing gave me, and it's as you're going through, and then pretty soon you're in a master's class, of poetry, and you're in with a very small group of students. Like I think there were like 8 of us, and it's I think there's an element of competitiveness that I did not enjoy. There was an element of so many of the younger students wanting to write what they thought the prof wanted. And as a prof myself, I tell my students, don't write to me. Like, don't sit down and think, oh, I'm going to write this because this is what she wants. No, I first off, I'm not going to tell you what I want. Second off, you have to sort yourself out and put it down on paper. And I will, like, if some of them are really feeling as though they're struggling, I will do a quick read of their work, and give a little bit of commentary. But when I don't recall, having to sit through that lecture, make use of the five senses, or maybe I was just a really rotten student and I wasn't paying attention. It could easily have been that.
Well, the way you do it is
Oh,
brilliant in any case.
thank you, thank you.
Yeah. So
But
on a bit of
people love that story, Daryl. They love Amak. They love it, and I think they love it because it's about family, and so it's easy to relate to. And every family fights. I always say it. Every family fights, and if they're not fighting, well, they've got a problem in that family if they're not fighting with each other. And so I think that's what draws people to Amak, is because it's about family, and it's about growing up together in this really messed up house. But then you're out in the world, and now you've had your own kids, and you haven't talked to each other in over a decade, and finally you get to come back together. And so how do you do that? How do you come back together after all these years of silence? And I think that's a common theme within many, many families. I'm actually shocked that people like that story so much.
Yeah,
Because a lot
yeah,
of people are like, oh, talk about that story. And I think, really?
yeah.
It's not even the best one.
Well, Norma, I'm gonna shift gears a bit, and I want to ask you about something that's near and dear to my heart. Uh, what was it like to find out that you had won the Governor General's Award for 2021 for this year?
Wow, that was Darrel. That was like 5 straight days of crying. Like that's what that was. And and you know, you get the phone call in advance, and then you're told, "Shh, don't talk about it." and and I just cried. Like that's all I could do. I just cried. It was completely unexpected, completely. And I did not even know that my book had been entered. I did not know. And so when I get an email saying you're a finalist, and I'm thinking, what? and then and then to get the call, like that was honestly, that was just 5 days of steady crying. And it's like,
Oh.
well, you should know. You know what it's like, Daryl. You cry for 5 days.
With the Writers Trust finalist situation, I had one of the biggest crying spells I've had in years, for sure. And so that's really validating, and I know where you're coming from. I totally get where you're coming from as an Indigenous. I'm guessing that, for me, certainly as an Indigenous person, having that level of validation. And one of the beauties of winning the Governor General's Award is that, Norma, you weren't competing against in an Indigenous category. Your book wasn't competing in an Indigenous category or, you know, um, emerging writers category or anything like that. You were competing against everybody and the best and the brightest, the most accomplished, and you won it. And so there was something to
I
cry
mean,
about.
yeah, 5 days in a row, and then a few more days again. But I think it's. I always, when I found out I was finalist, I thought, nah, like this isn't going to happen. And this is how I think of it. I think of it as like I have everything that works against me. I'm old, I'm native, and I'm female. All those things, like when you think about those three things, I'm one of the least marketable people to put out there when it comes to, when it comes to from, I think especially from a marketing position and whether or not that book is going to make any money, like and I think, but I think also that all Indigenous writers come up against this, where, and I mean, this has been my experience with my books, is my book is not as heavily marketed. And when it is, I think that the publishers don't know how to handle it and how to get me out there, get my work out there. And it's so that I think there's a real need for Indigenous editors, Indigenous publishers. There's a real need, and in our country, we have a very, like, I can only think of three Indigenous publishers, and they're always horribly underfunded, and may be able to put out 2 books in a year, so that they don't have the funding or the money to really get anything going. But I think there is a need for Indigenous people within the publishing industry. Like there's a real need for it.
I don't know if you're aware of the publisher, Douglas and McIntyre, and
Yeah,
with me they were wonderful. And one of the good things is, um, once I won the Governor General's Award, it was kind of like I was a bigger fish in a smaller pond, sort of thing. And they threw their all before I won the GG's award. They, as a smaller publisher, I guess a medium-sized publisher, they threw amazing resources at my book, and it was more attention that I would have gotten had I been with a larger publisher, I guess. But I know what you mean. The larger publishing houses, have this relationship with the books like Chapters Indigo, and I guess with Amazon and others, and they can get their books right out and onto the leading bookshelves with special attention right away, and so it's a bit tricky for sure. But I think the GT's award will help with the marketing of your book a lot, and it'll be interesting to
Well,
see what happens now.
you know what I thought? She released very strongly in Eastern Canada, but nothing out here. And I live out here. And she's nowhere on the Alberta booksellers list. She's nowhere on the Edmonton bookseller list. And I know that she was submitted for Scotia Giller, but she didn't long list. And so then I thought, well, book's going to do nothing. She's not going to do anything. And I don't know how it works, how she released so strongly in the East, and people in the East just loved her. Out West, she was nowhere. But it was, I think Douglas and McIntyre have been very good to me. And I mean, they took a chance. They took a chance that not every publisher would. On an old Eskimo lady sitting in Edmonton writing books. Like, they took a chance, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful.
Yeah, and I'm older than you, and they took a chance on me. So yeah, it was
I love
great. It
that.
was a really amazing experience. I loved, speaking of which, I love the cover of your book, and I'm just curious how that came about. It's an absolutely beautiful cover.
I saw her on. I do when I purchase any kind of Inuit art or jewelry, I purchase it through Feely Fine Arts in Toronto. And so I'll go on and dream about all the things I wish I had in my house. And I seen this print. And when I talked earlier about being Padlai Inuit, and about Inuit amongst themselves would say, those people, like we were also called the people of the willow, the people from beyond, and we were also the unseen ones. But we are Caribou Inuit, and caribou was our main food, and so this cover was Caribou Woman, and when I saw it, I just fell in love with it. So I pick up the phone and I call Feely Fine Arts. And they know me a little bit, like the girl who her name is Emily, and I said, "Hi, Emily, it's Norma Dunning," and she's like, "Oh, hi, Norma. What do you need?" And I said, I'd like to know who is in charge of this print." And so she gave me his name and his email, and I emailed him and said, "I'd like this print for the cover of my book. So how much are you letting it go for?" And he came back with a quote, and it was very, very reasonable. So it was beautiful. It was just wonderful to have that kind of collaboration, and with another Indigenous person, like two artists talking to each other, and me saying, "Oh, I really like this. Like, I really want to push with this cover."
Yeah. Well, one last question, Norm. I want you to have the last word, of course. And I just, and I don't know how you're going to answer this, but what is it that you love about your book the most?
It's always the same for me, Darrel. I fall in love with all of my characters. I love them, and it's sometimes it's hard to build that manuscript and PDF it and send it out. But what I love, I think, is there's humor that I loved writing, and for me, if I make myself laugh, then it's good. There's also some very, very hard, violent scenes, And writing that kind of violence is really, I don't know how to say. I have to go out for a walk after. I can sit down and I can write it, and I'll think like it's on. I'm on. I'm on. I'm on. This is good. But now I have to vomit because I've written myself into getting sick. So for me, like we have to have that kind of, if we're not experiencing what our characters are experiencing, and if we're not feeling it, the reader will not feel it. They will not. How can they? We're not doing our best for our audience. And so for me, I love the character Itura, who is the spirit. And they walk around. He walks around Edmonton with priests. I love him, and I always think if I have a writer's crush, it's on that guy, because because he's like my perfect man. He's fun. He's got energy. he laughs all the time, and I think he's the perfect guy. And so for me, it's I fall in love with them, and I think about them afterwards. After they're tucked away in a story, and there's a part of me that always thinks, I wonder what they're doing today. Like I wonder what they're doing now. so, so to me, you have to have that kind of love, for what you brought together. And if it isn't there, then don't write it. Don't put it. If you don't feel it, if you don't experience it, your reader will not either. So it's making those kind of visceral reactions, but you're doing it to yourself. When I write the rape scene of Annie in this book, and I wrote that rape, and and then that was like a 2 hour walk. Yeah, I had to go walk it off, like go out and walk it off. And so I do a lot of that where I write and walk and write and walk. But I feel like, when I get away from the screen and now you're just out on a walk, then I can, it's like it's clearer. Everything becomes clearer when I'm alone acting, and then then I'm ready to go back and start again.
Well, it's been a wonderful visit, Norma, and I can't wait until we meet in person. And I travel through Edmonton now and then to see my family, so I'll make sure we get a visit in. There's a
Ew,
lot more to
ew.
talk about. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. And thank you
Thank
to
you. Thank you
Writers
so much.
thank you to Writers Trust for bringing us together and giving us this wonderful opportunity, this gift of time with one another, and especially during the pandemic. Boy, we have to work harder at connecting, and I would just like to really, really thank the Writers Trust for this great time. Thank you for that.
And I echo that. They've been wonderful with me. So thank you very much to the Writers Trust too. And thank you for your time, Norman, your generosity of spirit and all of your insights. It was just wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Yeah.